The early rain fell like a veil of mist over the mountain road. A war veteran in his 40s walked in silence, his loyal German shepherd, Max, at his side. They had nothing left but each other, and an uncertain day waiting ahead. Suddenly Max froze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His eyes locked on an old, rotted wagon abandoned by the roadside. Why would such a worthless relic be hidden so carefully? And what secret could it possibly hold inside? What John was about to uncover would change everything, a truth buried for more than a century. But before we begin this journey, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave your country in the comments below. The fog clung low over Blacktail Ridge, and the drizzle stitched fine silver lines across the pines. Wind slid through burned timber like a quiet hand through beads, carrying the smell of wet bark, cold iron, and the first hard rumor of winter. John Miller walked the shoulder of the cracked mountain road with the steady, economical gait of a man who no longer wasted motion. 47, broad-shouldered but worn lean by seasons of shift work and long miles, he carried his history the way he carried his canvas rucksack, close, practical, and patched where it had torn. A small scar divided his right eyebrow like a pale hyphen. Another grazed the line of his jaw, a souvenir from a door that hadn't waited for permission in a house that should have been safe. He'd been an Army combat engineer for most of his 20s and 30s, built bridges, broke obstacles, and learned what happened when maps lied and metal told the truth. The war had taught him not to argue with gravity or water or silence. It had also taught him a habit of scanning edges, counting exits, and measuring the distance between impulse and consequence. He did those things now without thinking. The tilt of the slope above the ditch, the fresh grooves of ATV tires, the way the fog pooled thicker in the cut near Devil's Switchback. At his knee moved Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that deepened from toasted wheat along his flanks to ink at the saddle. Max's right ear had a small notch that made him look perpetually alert. His left shoulder carried a thin, oval scar beneath the fur where a wire fence had once tried to say no. He was tall for his breed, long in the leg, with the calm posture of a dog who could hold still for hours and then become speed. He watched the world with amber eyes that weighed rather than judged, and when he breathed you could hear it faintly, like a bellows whispering in a smithy. John had found him 3 winters back, sleeping with his nose tucked under his tail in the lee of a dumpster behind the mill. The shelter said unadoptable, guard drive too high. John had laughed once at that, a quiet sound that didn't quite make it to his eyes, and signed the paper anyway. They fit each other like old gear, scar to scar, purpose to purpose. They reached Greywater, which was less a town than a stubborn cluster of buildings with roofs the color of river stones. The general store sat at the corner, where the pavement forgot itself and became gravel. Faded feed sacks hung from nails, and a hand-painted sign advertised coffee that had won some kind of contest you could only win by surviving it. The bell over the door did not ring so much as creak a memory. Inside, warmth smelled of cinnamon, diesel, and wet wool. Martha Henderson stood behind the counter, tallying receipts with the concentration of a woman who could run a small country if you gave her a pencil. 56, tall and spare as a fence post, Martha wore her silver-streaked hair in a utilitarian braid and denim that had seen more seasons than most marriages. Strong hands, clean nails, a small scar at the base of her throat from a thyroid surgery she never mentioned, unless someone else needed to know surgeries could be survived. She had the kind of face that tempers mischief with mercy. Folks in Greywater said Martha could spot a liar from the way they picked up a loaf of bread. John nodded. Morning. It would be, if that mist would decide what it wants to be when it grows up, Martha said, sliding a paper cup under the pot. You look like rain found you first. Her tone was easy, but her eyes had already done a full inventory. Boots damp, rucksack heavier than last week, dog's coat clean, jaw tight. She set the coffee down without asking and added a wedge of cornbread wrapped in waxed paper. On the house, John started to protest, then saw the look that meant it would just cost him pride and her patience. He took the food with a small incline of the head. You hear anything about day work? Mill's running 1 shift till they clear the jam, she said. Owen's looking to hire 2 men to get tarps on his south hay before it molds. She paused, then lowered her voice the way people do when sound itself might be listening. and the boys from up canyon are making noise again. Same old ghost story, just louder. The door opened, and a gust dragged the fog in by the collar. Owen Pike stomped his boots on the mat. 40, thick through the chest, beard like winter rye, palms broad and calloused from decades of hay hooks and ropes. He moved with the off-balance of a man who'd been thrown and kept getting back on. His right ring finger wore a dent where a band had been. He was not unkind, but he was not gentle with fools or animals that hurt for fun. Rumor said the drought had taken half his cattle last year. Rumor also said he still delivered milk to the old folks for free. Martha, he said by way of greeting, then to John with a chin jerk. You got a tarp hand? I can learn fast, and he knows knots, John said, meaning Max with a roll of his wrist. Owen grunted, which was gray water, for we'll see. He took a tin of screws from a shelf and leaned his hip against the counter, as if the country might kick again. You two heading south later? Depends, John said. On whether south is where the work is. Work and other things, Owen said, eyes sliding toward the window, as if the fog could overhear. Boys from the quarry claim they saw foxfire last night out at Hollow's Bend, blue light licking the spokes of that cursed wagon again. He realized he had said more than he'd intended and snorted at his own superstition. Hear me tellin' stories like Grandpa. Next, I'll be selling charms for the radiator. John sipped coffee, letting the heat occupy his hands while his mind sorted what it would keep. Hollow's Bend. He had heard the name whispered the way you whisper the first and last parts of a prayer, as if the middle might summon something. A month ago, a trapper from out near Chilcot, Joel Hauser, mid-30s, narrow-faced, always smelled faintly of spruce pitch and kerosene, had bragged he would camp by the wagon to prove the whole county was made of children. He'd come back at dawn with his bedroll soaked and a second-hand tremor in both hands, unable to keep the coffee in the cup. He said there had been a sound like knuckles on a door under the floorboards and a blue, breathing light that moved like it remembered how to be a person. People laughed in his face because that's what you do when you are afraid and need somebody to hold your fear for you. 2 weeks after that, a teenager named Reese Cutter vanished after telling friends he was going to film the haunted wagon for clicks. His mother, Lacey Cutter, early 40s, curly black hair always pinned up, nurse at the clinic with a voice that could unpanic a room, had stood on the church steps with her palms open and her grief displayed for inventory. Sheriff's men found Reese's bicycle leaned careful against a hemlock, like it needed the tree to stand. No sign of a struggle, no sign of anything. The sheriff had said, wolves, the way a man says lightning when the house is ash and there's no other story left to tell. In Greywater, stories go to ground and seed, then come up in the cracks where you can't pull them. Martha slid a small notebook toward John. If you're going south, take the logging road, not the washout. Slow slide under the sleet. And if you get a choice of walking past hollows or circling the long way by the river, take the river. I don't need you getting yourself stupid for a shortcut. She said it as if she were scolding a stubborn nephew. Her mouth softened. What I'm saying is, mind yourself. Always do, John said. It wasn't quite humor, but it nodded in that direction. The truth was this. He didn't believe in ghosts that drank axle grease or wagons that remembered names. He believed in leverage and decay, in methane pockets and pranksters with lanterns on sticks, and men who hid greed under folklore because folklore obeyed different laws than police. He believed in grief so heavy it condensed into weather. He believed in the kindness of coffee and the arithmetic of hunger. But he also believed that fear was a tool, like a crowbar. You could pry a door open with it or break your hand. And something in the way Max had turned his head toward that south window teased the math of his curiosity. Owen scratched his beard, eyes on Max. Good-looking dog. How old? 6, John said. Smart? John didn't answer. He snapped his fingers once, a small sound like a dropped tack. Max sat, then lay, then rose, each movement quiet, as if the floor had feelings. Owen's mouth did the smallest of things. I'll meet you at the hay by noon, he said. If you're late, we start without you. And if you go near that bend, take a stick. A stick? For the courage you'll pretend you don't need. He left on that line, which was his way of saving face from generosity. They ate the cornbread at a two-top near the window. Outside, The fog thickened into something that looked like honest rain. Max watched the street with measured attention, focusing not on motion, but on intention, a skill he had learned without a name. John's thoughts went where they always went when the weather narrowed, the quiet room he used to live in behind his left eye, the one where Elena's voice still lived, patient, a low mezzo that could smooth the burrs off bad days. She had died 2 years into remission because sometimes victory laps are short and the finish line has teeth. After the funeral, the house turned into a museum of her absence, and he could no more live in it than in a glass case. So, he sold the place, paid what could be paid, and measured his life out in coffee and miles. People said he had become a drifter, which wasn't correct. Drifters move without friction. John had plenty of friction. Work to find, bills to nibble, tasks to put against the day like wedges holding a door open. He kept going because forward was the direction he knew best. But forward felt different today, as if the road had taken a vote in private. He left the store with a length of paracord, a cheap poncho, and the kind of canned soup that apologized for itself. Martha's parting gift was a look that said, "Don't be an idiot," and a small bag of jerky for Max that she claimed had fallen off a truck named Charity. The rain had found its courage. Gray water blurred to watercolor around them as they headed south along the logging road. You could smell the river now, a cold metal scent under the resin and rot, and hear the occasional shot of a branch shedding its water in a single shrug. Deer tracks stitched along the verge. A coyote's pads mapped a converging angle. After a mile, the road bent around a spur where the mountain had slouched decades ago and never stood up again. A weathered sign leaned at an angle that said it had given up making points. Hollows Bend. 1. Max slowed, not balking, just subtracting speed the way a craftsman shaves wood. His ears tilted, then settled into a forward slant. The ridge opened into a shallow bowl where younger alders tasseled the ground, and a black stump garden remembered a fire so hot the soil had glassed. The wagon sat at the far lip of the bowl, crooked at a tilt, like a question asked too late. Even at distance, John could feel the wrongness that attaches itself to objects when stories graft onto wood. The canvas that once roofed the bow ribs had rotted into a fringe. The wheels wore belts of moss, and one iron hoop had slipped like a ring from a thin finger. The tongue jutted naked, pointing toward nothing. Around it, the fog thickened and thinned as if persuaded by breath. John had never been a man to generalize from shapes and weather, and he was not in the habit of seeing Jesus in toast. Still, the air above the rear axle had a faint blue cast, the kind given off by marsh gas or a failing battery, which made no sense because the wagon was neither. He listened, rain on alder, a distant jay peeling the sky, and then something inside the wagon's box, a sound so small it could have been a mouse or a settling board, a slow, deliberate tap like a finger remembering manners. He waited. It did not repeat. Max lifted his nose, drank the air in short sips, then exhaled in a quiet huff that meant interest without alarm. John watched the ground the way a soldier watches an unmarked field, reading scuffs, depressions, the language of recentness. No boot prints, no tire tracks. The moss near the rear wheel had been disturbed in a small circle the size of a palm. He felt the small tightening in his chest that was not fear, not yet, but its cousin anticipation. He had come for hay work. He had found a roomer made of wood. He did not step closer. Not today. Some doors should be tested with time first, not hands. He marked the angles, the distance from the alder snag that forked low, the way the ground fell away near the stump scar, and drew the map behind his eyes the way he had been trained. Ground, route, enemy, friendly, mission. The enemy here, if any, was not spirit but story, and men who use story for cover. He touched Max's shoulder, a small pressure that meant we're moving. Max moved. They circled wide, took the long way to Owen's hay, and left the wagon alone in its bowl, the fog closing around it like a mouth deciding against speech. By noon, they were on Owen's south field, tarps coughing in the wind, rope burns blooming on John's fingers like minor constellations. Work was honest in the way weather is honest. It told you what it was with weight and breath. The rhythm quieted his mind, which did not mean it forgot. At 3, with the tarps anchored and Owen's thanks delivered in the currency of 220s, A gallon of diesel and a grudging nod. John stood at the edge of the field and looked back toward the notch where hollows darkened the slope. He did not say anything aloud. He did not need to. The decision had settled in him with the quiet gravity of a stone placed exactly where it had always meant to go. He would come back at dawn, when the night had told all the lies it could, and the light was new enough to tell on it. Max leaned lightly against his leg, as if to say that sometimes decisions were just acknowledgments. The rain had softened to mist again, and the mountains seemed to listen, patient as an old teacher, to the footsteps of a man and his dog walking out of one story and toward another. At dawn, the fog thinned into ribbons, and the mountainside glittered with last night's rain, every pine needle strung with droplets like a rosary of glass. John Miller returned to Hollow's Bend with Max pacing beside him, their boots and paws sinking into the soft mulch where elk had passed before. He had spent the night helping Owen tie down hay bales, but the wagon would not leave his mind. When the wind scraped against the tin roof of the shed, he kept hearing the faint knock he'd caught in the bowl. A soldier learns to ignore superstition, but he also learns to investigate anomalies. Today he meant to test which the wagon was. The wagon crouched in the clearing, as if it had waited centuries just to be acknowledged. Its frame leaned further to one side now, and the shadows underneath looked thicker than the simple play of morning light. John adjusted his rucksack, his jaw tightening with the small ritual of a man choosing to move forward against instinct. He touched Max's flank. The shepherd's fur bristled, his ears pinning forward, and then a deep growl unfurled from his chest. It was not aggression. Max rarely wasted energy on empty threats. It was warning, sharp and certain. John studied the animal's posture and knew whatever lived in this wagon was no mere echo of time. Still, he advanced, one deliberate step at a time, scanning the ground. He noticed scuffs in the dirt, not animal prints, but the broad arcs of boots dragged unwillingly. The moss along the axle was darker, as if something wet had soaked into it overnight. He bent, touched the soil, brought his fingers to his nose. Copper, faint but undeniable. Blood had been here. A twig snapped behind him. John spun, shoulders tense, only to see Caleb Morton standing at the edge of the bowl. Caleb was 60, stooped but still thick across the shoulders, with a face like bark left too long in the sun. A narrow mustache shaded his lip. His jaw bristled with the beginnings of a beard that never quite decided to grow. His eyes, pale blue, looked both suspicious and weary, the kind of eyes that had measured too many graves. He had served in Vietnam as a radio operator, and folks whispered that he'd never really come back. He ran the small sawmill north of Greywater, spoke little, and drank more than he admitted. But he had a code. Keep the woods safe, keep outsiders cautious. "You don't want that wagon," Caleb said, voice sandpaper and whiskey. "Things been bad luck since my daddy's day. Animals won't graze near it. Men go near it, they come back wrong, if they come back at all." He spat into the soil as if punctuation. John straightened, meeting the man's gaze. "Bad luck doesn't creak at night. Something's in there." Caleb's laugh was low, bitter. "Something always is. Folks need their devils. Me, I've seen enough not to pick fights with old wood." He shifted, eyes narrowing at Max, who had stopped growling, but remained stiff. That dog's smarter than most men. If he says no, maybe listen. But John's nature, hardened by war, told him retreat invited worse dangers. He approached the wagon, ran his hand along the ribs of wood, felt the rot crumble like stale bread. He pulled at a loosened plank, and the sound echoed far too loudly, as though the wagon itself had lungs. Inside, the gloom was thicker than expected, pockets of shadow clinging stubbornly despite daylight. Max barked once, sharp, echoing off the ridge. The air grew colder, damp as if from underground cellars. A flutter inside, paper, not wings. John reached in and withdrew a bundle, scraps of cloth, brittle as parchment, wrapped around a small child's shoe. Brown leather, cracked, a buckle green with rust. He turned it over in his hands, and for the first time since Afghanistan, his stomach pitched in that old, sick way. He could picture too easily a girl's foot in that shoe, running, stumbling, stopped. Caleb swore under his breath, pulled his jacket tighter. "Told you, that wagon don't carry hay, it carries graves." My uncle swore he heard crying from it in '68 before he shot himself. You want to follow him?" John did not answer. He placed the shoe back, carefully, then noticed carvings etched along the wagon's floorboards, crude initials, overlapped by deeper cuts shaped like crosses. Someone had tried to mark the place as holy ground, or at least protected. He felt his breath grow shallow, not from fear, but from weight, the heavy presence of history unresolved. A sudden rustle from the tree line interrupted. Emerging from the shadows was Clara Bennett, a woman of 32 with auburn hair tied back messily, freckles dotted across pale skin, and wide hazel eyes that betrayed both courage and caution. She wore a wool coat 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled, and carried a lantern even though morning had arrived. Clara worked at the Greywater Diner, pouring coffee with a steady smile, but everyone knew she had lost her brother to the woods 5 years ago. She'd never stopped searching, never stopped believing some answers lay hidden near Hollow's Bend. She raised her chin at John, ignoring Caleb's glare. "You found it, didn't you?" "The shoe. My brother went missing near here. He was 10. Folks said wolves, but wolves don't buckle shoes." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't look away. John regarded her, then the wagon, then Max, who had sat but remained vigilant. He felt the old tug inside, the soldier's instinct to carry what others could not. "It was there," he said quietly, showing her the bundle. "But this doesn't prove whose it was." Clara stepped closer, her hand trembling as she touched the shoe. "He wore ones just like this. Mama kept the pair in a box, said if he came back, he'd need them." Her face hardened, grief twisting into resolve. "If there are more answers in that wagon, I want them." Caleb shook, his head violently. "Fool talk! That wagon's cursed. Whatever happened 100 years ago don't need dragging out. Let the dead keep their secrets." But John had already decided. He climbed onto the wagon bed, Max leaping after him, despite his obvious unease. The boards groaned beneath their combined weight, as if remembering too much. He pried open another panel, and this time a cascade of small bones spilled out. Animal, mostly rabbit, some bird. Yet among them lay a human hand bone, unmistakable, curled like it had never unclenched. Clara gasped, covering her mouth, while Caleb cursed again and backed away. For John, the discovery was not supernatural. It was evidence. And evidence meant truth, buried by fear. He turned the bone over gently, then looked at Clara. "Your brother deserves better than rumors. So do the rest." His tone carried the flat iron of a man who had buried too many comrades without markers. Max barked again, sharper, and this time his hackles rose fully. From the woods came movement. 2 figures in hunting jackets, broad men with rifles slung carelessly, but eyes too deliberate. They were locals, faces familiar from around Greywater. Roy Jensen, a farmer's son in his late 30s, heavy-set with a patchy beard and the kind of permanent squint that comes from suspicion, and Dale Crowder, thin as wire, with hollow cheeks, eyes darting like minnows, his jaw always grinding tobacco. Both were known for running errands no one respectable wanted, their tempers short, their debts long. "Morning," Roy said, though his tone held no warmth. "Funny place to go poking around. Folks say you mess with that wagon, you stir up things best left alone." Dale spat to the side, added, "Or maybe you stir up things people still got a claim to." John squared his shoulders, Max at his side, Clara just behind him. Caleb muttered something about fools and stepped further back, unwilling to pick a side. John's mind ticked over quickly, the old combat calculus. 2 men with rifles, but casual in their grip, meant intimidation, not immediate violence. Yet their eyes said more. They weren't here for ghost stories. They were here because the wagon still held value to someone. He spoke evenly, voice carrying authority that had survived deserts and mines. Whatever happened here, it wasn't ghosts. It was people. And people leave tracks. You 2 know more about that than you're saying. Roy's squint narrowed, Dale's jaw worked harder, but neither moved closer. Perhaps it was Max, standing taut, a low growl vibrating through the wagon bed like wire under tension. Perhaps it was Clara's burning stare, grief now sharpened into defiance. The standoff hung until the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. Roy finally shrugged, as if dismissing them, though his eyes lingered with promise of return. Suit yourself, but don't say you weren't warned. The two men turned, disappearing into the trees like shadows unpinned from bodies. Silence fell again, heavier for having been broken. John looked at Clara, then at Caleb. This wagon isn't cursed. It's evidence, and I'm going to find out whose story it tells. Max barked once in agreement, amber eyes blazing. The decision was set. Whatever fear the wagon carried, John would face it. Because fear, he knew, was only the first step toward truth. The fog lifted only slightly as the sun climbed over Blacktail Ridge, but the light that filtered into Hollow's Bend carried no warmth. John Miller stood by the wagon with Clara Bennett close beside him, while Max paced in tense circles, ears twitching at every sound. The discovery of bones in a child's shoe in the last visit had left them shaken, but determined. John knew the wagon held more than superstition. It was a record of something real, hidden under layers of rot and fear. He braced himself and climbed back onto the warped planks, this time prying deeper into the wagon's belly. His calloused fingers scraped over rough surfaces until he found the strange carvings again. The symbols weren't random. They were deliberate etchings. Crooked crosses, spirals, and initials that looked scorched into the wood. Some were childlike, uneven, as if carved by trembling hands. Others were precise, straight, and repeated in patterns, like a code. He whispered them under his breath, trying to memorize the order, while Clara leaned in, her freckles paling. Then he spotted it, half buried under splinters, wrapped in faded cloth, stained dark with old blood. He drew out a leather-bound journal, stiff and brittle, its clasp half rusted but still intact. The smell of mildew and iron rose from it, pungent and old. The moment the book came into the air, Max let out a low whine, circling closer to John, as if the object itself unsettled him. John thumbed the cover, and the leather cracked under the pressure. He hesitated, then forced it open. The first pages were water-stained and nearly illegible. Scrawls of ink bled together into shadows. But a few words stood clear. Brennan, Gold, Moorcock. The name snapped like a wire in John's head. The Moorcocks. He had heard whispers in Greywater taverns of that family. Land barons who held half the county and claimed it through inheritance. No one dared question. Clara stiffened at the name, too, her eyes sharp. They've been around forever. Own most of the timber contracts. People say they're untouchable. John flipped further. Entries spoke of a family traveling west, of a man named Thomas Brennan, his wife Mary, and their daughter Emma. Thomas described striking flakes of gold near a creek, then scrawled warnings of men watching, threats wrapped in polite words. The later pages grew frantic, words written at angles, sentences half finished. They follow us. Night, Emma cries, Mary says run, blood. The final entry ended in a violent ink blot, as if the writer had been dragged away mid-sentence. Clara pressed her lips together, whispering, Emma, my brother's name was Ben. What if... She didn't finish the thought, but her fingers trembled as she traced the page. Beneath the journal, wedged in a false floorboard, lay a metal lockbox no larger than a lunch pail. Its surface was scarred, but the clasp remained firm. John lifted it, and the faint clatter inside spoke of coins, perhaps documents, maybe more bones. He shook it lightly, and the echo rang sharp against the hollow wagon frame. Clara's eyes widened. Open it! Before John could reply, a new voice cut through the clearing. Don't! Sarah McKenna stepped out of the tree line, boots crunching on wet soil. She was 38, tall and lean, with an academic air sharpened by years of solitary research. Her auburn hair was pinned in a practical bun, though loose strands clung to her cheeks dampened by mist. Her skin was pale from library hours, her dark gray eyes both curious and cautious. She carried a satchel, heavy with books, maps, and a camera slung over one shoulder. Sarah had grown up in Greywater, but left for the state university, only to return as an archivist for the county's historical society. Locals thought her aloof, too proud for small-town gossip, but truthfully she had been shaped by loss. Her younger sister had vanished when Sarah was 16, and no body had ever been found. That wound had driven her to catalog the town's ghosts in records and testimonies. determined that no one's story should vanish again. "You opened that box without care," she said, her voice firm, "and whatever's inside could be destroyed. Paper from that era can crumble at a breath." She moved closer, kneeling beside the wagon, her fingers brushing the carvings. "These aren't just symbols. They're protection marks, common in the 1800s. Families carved them to ward off evil, or men who played at being evil." She glanced at John, her eyes narrowing with recognition. "You're the veteran who came through last winter, aren't you?" "The one who lived in the mill shed?" John nodded once. He had no patience for introductions. "If this box holds answers, we'll find a way to open it." Sarah studied him, then Clara, then Max, who met her gaze with a steady stare, ears flicking forward. "Answers are dangerous when men still live who don't want them found. The Moorcocks built their empire on silence." She lowered her voice. "And silence demands payment." Before John could question her further, Max barked sharply, turning toward the woods. Leaves rustled, and moments later, Martha Henderson appeared, trudging with a wicker basket on her arm. She looked weary but determined, her braid damp, her denim jacket streaked with mud. "I figured you'd come back here," Martha said, her eyes settling on the wagon with undisguised distaste. "Half the town's whispering already. Thought I'd better see before rumors get worse." She set the basket down, revealing bread, jerky, and a thermos. "Fuel for whatever fool idea you're chasing." Sarah straightened, bristling. "This isn't foolish, Martha. This is evidence of a family erased." Martha sighed, her face lined with both age and worry. "I don't doubt that, Sarah. But evidence doesn't stop bullets, and the Moorcocks, they don't scare easy." John weighed the journal in his hands, then set it carefully in his rucksack. The lockbox he wrapped in his poncho, binding it with paracord. "We'll open it somewhere safe," he said finally. Clara looked at him with both hope and dread. Sarah's expression was grim but resolute. Martha muttered something about stubborn men and stubborn ghosts, but she didn't take the basket back. As the group prepared to leave, Max refused to turn his back on the wagon, his ears pinned, his growl low, his gaze fixed on the carvings inside. John touched his head gently. "I know," he murmured. "We'll be back." They left Hollow's Bend together, carrying the journal and the lockbox, shadows of the past pressing close behind. By the following week, the whispers had become a roar. In Graywater's diner, in the aisles of the general store, even outside the small church with its white steeple cracked by lightning, people spoke of John Miller's return to Hollow's Bend. The story had already grown legs. Some said he pulled bones out of the wagon and left them on Martha's counter. Others claimed he had summoned blue fire that licked around his boots while the dog howled like a prophet. The truth mattered little. Fear traveled faster. And in a town where superstition had always coiled beneath the surface, fear meant distance. John felt the weight of it when he walked Main Street with Max. Faces turned away, greetings shortened to nods, children pulled closer by anxious parents. Clara Bennett, once just the waitress with a soft smile, now found herself whispered about too. People saying she'd dragged John into her grief, stirring shadows that ought to be left buried. Martha kept speaking to them openly, but even she noticed the looks. At night, when John slept in the shed behind the old mill, he heard voices outside, the clink of bottles, the hiss of curses, before footsteps faded. The line between rumor and threat had grown thin. Meanwhile, others saw opportunity where townsfolk saw terror. Roy Jensen and Dale Crowder had not stayed away. They spread their own version of the story, hinting that treasure lay inside the wagon and that John had already pocketed something. It was enough to draw outsiders, lean men from the logging camps, drifters who smelled of smoke and cheap whiskey, and one or two faces John did not recognize at all. One of them introduced himself at the diner where Clara worked. His name was Victor Hale, late 40s, tall with a frame like a fallen oak, wide shoulders narrowing to long arms that moved carefully, almost politely. He wore a weathered suit coat too fine for Graywater, dark hair slicked back but shot with silver, and his face bore a sharp jaw lined with neatly trimmed stubble. His eyes were gray, cold, but his smile was warm enough to make people doubt what they'd just seen. Victor had the manner of a man who had lost once, badly, and resolved never to lose again. He ordered black coffee, never touched sugar, and asked Clara about the wagon in a tone too casual. When she refused to answer, he simply smiled wider. "It's an old story," he said, "but sometimes old stories are worth gold." He left her a tip too large, the kind that felt more like a warning than generosity. Clara told John later, her voice taut. John nodded grimly. Men like Victor were not curiosity seekers. They were investors in secrets. Sarah McKenna had taken the journal back to her office at the Historical Society, a restored Victorian house where lace curtains softened tall windows and shelves groaned under county records. She had begun the delicate process of drying and photographing each page, careful hands steady despite the weight of history. When John visited, she looked more haggard, dark rings under her eyes. "This isn't just a family's tragedy," she said, tapping a page. "The Moorcocks appear again and again, in land claims, in disputes where witnesses disappeared, in petitions that stopped suddenly. This wagon could unravel the story they've buried." She straightened her spine, tall and defiant despite the exhaustion. "But the more I dig, the more I feel watched." John believed her. Twice now, he had noticed unfamiliar men lingering outside the Historical Society. Hats pulled low, cigarettes glowing in the dusk. Max had growled both times, the kind of growl that spoke of intent rather than accident. Fear tightened its grip further when Sheriff Donahue finally visited John. Donahue was a broad man in his mid-50s, with a square jaw hidden beneath a salt and pepper beard, and eyes that once might have been kind but had long since hardened into stone. He carried himself with the weariness of a man who had seen every kind of fight end badly. His uniform strained at the belt, his boots were scuffed, his revolver holster worn smooth from years of habit. People respected him, but few trusted him entirely. He had a reputation for pragmatism, which in Greywater often meant favoring whoever kept the peace, even if they weren't clean. He found John by the mill and spoke plainly. "You've stirred a hornet's nest. People are scared, Miller. They think you brought something out of that wagon that should have stayed there." His tone was not angry, but edged with fatigue. "I'm telling you for your own good. Leave it. Whatever's in that box or that book, it isn't worth the town burning itself over." John studied the sheriff, then asked the only question that mattered. "Are you warning me because you believe the curse, or because someone else told you to?" Donahue didn't answer right away. He looked off toward the hills, jaw working, then muttered, "Sometimes the dead don't scare me half as much as the living." And with that, he walked away, leaving John with more questions. The unease reached a peak on Saturday night, during the weekly gathering at the church hall. The town came for stew, for hymns, for talk. This time the talk was all about the wagon. Some demanded it be burned, others muttered about digging it out for the gold inside. Clara sat alone at a table, ignored by women she had once called friends. Martha stood behind her, arms folded, daring anyone to speak ill in her presence. Sarah addressed the room briefly, declaring that history should not be destroyed, that the journal belonged to the people, not to fear. She was met with silence, then murmurs that she was just stirring trouble. In the shadows near the door, Victor Hale watched, silent, his expression unreadable. He left before the meeting ended. Later that night, John returned to his shed and found the lock broken. The rucksack where he had stored the lockbox was open, its straps cut clean. The box itself was gone. Max barked furiously, nose pressed to the ground, tracing the intruder's path until it vanished near the road. John clenched his fists, a cold fire burning in his chest. He had known it would come to this, but the violation still stung. Clara arrived breathless minutes later, having seen two men loading something into a truck, Roy and Dale, drunk but triumphant. The town now had its proof that greed spoke louder than fear. And for John, the haunting had spread beyond whispers. It was flesh and blood, men willing to steal and perhaps kill to guard secrets older than themselves. He stared down the road, Max's growl steady at his side, and vowed. The lockbox might be gone, but the truth would not. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, tapping on tin roofs and dripping from pine boughs like a clock that refused to stop ticking. John Miller lay on the cot inside the mill's shed, his rucksack tucked beneath his arm, Max stretched across the doorway like a sentinel. Sleep came in fits, when it came at all. The loss of the lockbox gnawed at him, a soldier's instinct screaming that What had been taken would be twisted, used. Every creak of timber sounded too deliberate, every whistle of wind too sharp. Then came the sound that pulled him upright, hand instinctively reaching for the iron crowbar he kept by the bed, wheels grinding across wet earth. The sound was impossible. The wagon at Hollow's Bend had not moved in over a century, its wheels swallowed by moss, its axles rotted. Yet, in the dark, the unmistakable groan of wood and iron echoed through the valley. Max exploded into barking, hackles raised, charging out into the yard. His paws splashed mud as he circled wildly, growling into the mist, gaze fixed toward the south where Hollow's Bend lay. The sound of wheels stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep John swore he could hear his own heartbeat. A lantern flickered in the trees. Figures emerged, 3 men, their boots heavy, their shadows swaying. John recognized 2 immediately, Roy Jensen and Dale Crowder. But the third was new. He was lean, tall, his coat long and black, hair cropped close to a skull lined with scars. His face was all angles, a narrow nose broken more than once, cheeks hollowed as if life had carved him lean, and a jaw dusted with a permanent shadow of stubble. His name, he introduced later with a thin smile, was Earl Vance. Earl was in his late 40s, a drifter known in distant towns as muscle for hire. He carried himself with the easy menace of someone who believed violence was currency, and he spent it freely. His eyes, a washed-out green, carried no light of hesitation. "Evening, Miller," Roy said, his squint narrower than ever. "We heard you've been hoarding something don't belong to you. Thought we'd come see for ourselves." Dale chuckled nervously, chewing his tobacco. Earl said nothing, only adjusted the knife on his belt, the lantern glow sliding across its blade. John kept his crowbar low but ready, his shoulders squared. "The lockbox you stole isn't mine or yours. It's evidence of a crime. You open it, you'll regret it." Roy smirked. "Funny, that's what they said about the wagon. Yet here we are, still breathing." He glanced at Dale, who shifted uncomfortably. "Mostly." Max lunged forward, snapping at the air, forcing Roy to take a step back. Earl, however, didn't flinch. He crouched, staring at the dog, his scarred lips curling in something close to admiration. "Fine animal," Earl muttered. "Be ashamed to see him bleed." Clara appeared then, having rushed from the diner when she'd seen the men heading toward the mill. She wore a patched coat, her auburn hair tangled from the rain, and her cheeks flushed with both fear and determination. "Leave him alone!" she shouted, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. Her voice cracked but carried conviction. Roy sneered. "Seems our cursed soldier has himself a cursed waitress too." Dale laughed, though uneasily. The tension snapped when Earl moved first. He lunged at John, knife flashing, and Max leapt between them, teeth sinking into Earl's forearm. Earl howled, swinging wildly, trying to shake the dog loose. John used the moment, swinging his crowbar hard, the clang ringing as it struck Earl's knife hand, sending the blade clattering into the mud. Roy raised his rifle, but Clara, shaking, shone her flashlight directly into his eyes, blinding him. Dale, panicked, swung his lantern and tripped, flames licking across the wet ground before sputtering. The fight collapsed into chaos. Max tore free, circling Roy, forcing him back with snarls. Earl staggered, blood dripping from his arm, but his grin widened, manic. "You think you can scare me with ghosts? I've walked with worse than ghosts." His voice rasped like gravel. He lunged again, barehanded now, but John drove the crowbar's butt into his ribs, the air wheezing out of him. Sarah McKenna arrived in the frenzy, drawn by the noise. She had been cataloging documents late at the Historical Society, and when the barking reached her ears, she had run across town with nothing but a heavy flashlight. Her bun had come loose, auburn strands plastered to her pale skin by rain, and her gray eyes burned with both terror and fury. She swung the flashlight like a club, cracking it across Dale's jaw with a force that surprised even her. He fell, cursing, clutching his face. Martha Henderson appeared moments later, breathless, her braid heavy with rain. She carried an old shotgun, barrel leveled with the steady hands of a woman who had broken up bar fights before most of the men in town were born. "Enough," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You'll not turn this town into a graveyard over a box of lies." The standoff froze. Earl, bleeding, leaned against a post, still grinning. Roy blinked hard, his rifle lowered, but not released. Dale whimpered, his face swelling. Max stood in the mud, chest heaving, amber eyes locked on Earl as though daring him to move again. "Sheriff will be here soon," Martha warned, "and if he finds you with blood on your hands, you won't be telling ghost stories. You'll be rotting in a cell." The intruders hesitated, then Roy jerked his head. "We'll be back. That wagon's ours, curse or not." They retreated into the trees, Earl's laughter trailing behind, harsh and hollow. Silence returned, broken only by the patter of rain and Max's low growl fading into a whimper as John knelt, checking his dog's side. Max was uninjured, save for mud and rain soaking his sable coat, but John's chest tightened with gratitude. He rubbed the dog's ears, whispering, "Good boy." "You saved me again?" Clara dropped her flashlight, her hands shaking uncontrollably, tears mingling with rain. Sarah steadied her, her own face pale but resolute. Martha exhaled, lowering her shotgun, her braid dripping water onto her boots. The night had shown them all that this was no longer rumor or relic. Men had drawn knives and rifles over what the wagon hid. The line between curse and greed had blurred until it was blood on the ground. And John knew one truth above all. The terror wasn't over. It had only begun. The rain had washed the streets of Greywater clean by morning, though the fear clinging to the town remained thick. John Miller walked with Max at his side, his boots leaving heavy impressions in the mud as he made his way to the Historical Society. His mind was still replaying the night before, Earl's knife flashing, Max's teeth sinking into flesh, Clara's trembling defiance, Sarah's strike with the flashlight, and Martha's steady hands on the shotgun. The fight had proven something important. He was no longer alone. Inside the old Victorian house that served as the Historical Society, Sarah McKenna bent over a table covered with maps, documents, and the leather-bound journal. The room smelled faintly of dust, ink, and rain seeping through old wood. Sarah looked pale, dark circles smudged beneath her gray eyes, her auburn hair pulled back loosely now, strands falling across her face. She had been awake most of the night, copying brittle entries by lamplight, careful not to destroy the fragile pages. She glanced up as John entered, then down at Max, who padded across the rug and lay by the stove with a low sigh. "It's worse than we thought," Sarah said, tapping a page. "The Brennan family, Thomas, Mary, and their daughter Emma, struck gold near Hollow's Bend in 1867. The journal tells us they feared men who followed them, offering help but demanding rights to the claim. The last entries suggest violence, threats, pursuit, and a final night where Thomas begged Mary to run with Emma while he stayed behind. Neither survived." She paused, her voice low. "The wagon was never haunted. It was a coffin for secrets." John leaned over the pages, his scarred fingers tracing the frantic handwriting. "And the Moorcocks?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "The journal names them directly. Thomas wrote of the men from the Moorcock camp who promised protection, then tried to seize the claim. Their wealth didn't come from hard work. It came from blood." Clara Bennett sat nearby, arms wrapped around herself. She wore a plain blue sweater that clung damply to her frame, her auburn hair unkempt, freckles stark against her pale cheeks. Her hazel eyes burned with grief and determination. "My brother disappeared in those woods. If the Moorcocks have been covering up crimes for generations, maybe that's why no one looked too hard when he vanished." Her voice shook but steadied as she continued. "This town has been living under their shadow for too long." Martha Henderson entered then, carrying a tray of coffee and bread. Her tall frame filled the doorway, silver braid damp from the rain. She set the tray down, her hands steady, eyes sharp. "I've lived here all my life," she said. "Seen good men ruined and bad men thrive because of that family. Folks don't call it a curse because of ghosts. They call it a curse because nobody who stood against the Moorcocks walked away whole." She looked directly at John. "And now, you've dragged it into the light." Before John could answer, the door creaked open again. A man in his early 30s stepped inside, removing a soaked hat. His name was Deputy Mark Fletcher, tall and lean, with dark blonde hair combed neatly, a square jaw half shaded by stubble, and blue eyes that carried both caution and integrity. He wore the sheriff's uniform, but lacked Donahue's heaviness. Fletcher had only been in Greywater 3 years, transferred after a scandal in another county where he had refused to falsify a report. That act had cost him friends and nearly his career, but it had carved his principles into stone. "I shouldn't be here," Fletcher said quietly, closing the door behind him. "But I heard about last night. Sheriff Donahue will look the other way, as he always does, but I won't. If the Moorcocks are tied to murders, I need proof. That journal might be—" Sarah handed him a copy of the entries she had transcribed. Fletcher read silently, his brow furrowing. "This, if it's verified, it's enough to open an inquiry. But you need more. The box Roy and Dale stole, if it holds maps, deeds, anything official, it could break this wide open." He looked at John, his voice firm. "You can't let it disappear." John studied the deputy. Fletcher's sincerity rang true, but John had learned not to place trust easily. Still, Max rose from the rug, patted over, and sniffed Fletcher's boots, then settled calmly by his leg. John exhaled. "We'll need allies." "More than just the 4 of us," Martha crossed her arms. "Allies are hard to come by when fear pays the rent. But I know a few old-timers who remember things. Folks the Moorcocks tried to silence. They might talk if they believe someone will finally listen." Sarah nodded. "I'll document everything. Photographs, affidavits. If they destroy the journal, they won't destroy the truth." Clara, her hands trembling, whispered, "But they'll come for us." John placed a steady hand on her shoulder. His rough palm, scarred and calloused, was surprisingly gentle. "They already have. That's why we stand together now. They want us divided, afraid. But I've learned something in war. Fear only wins when you let it." Max barked once, short and sharp, as though echoing the resolve. The group sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain against the windows. Outside, Greywater moved on with its daily rhythms, but inside that Victorian house, a fragile alliance had formed. They were bound by more than necessity. They were bound by truth. And though danger thickened like the storm, John felt something stir inside him he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The storm had broken by evening, leaving the air sharp and metallic, as though the valley itself was holding its breath. John Miller led the small group, Sarah, Clara, Martha, and Deputy Fletcher, back toward Hollow's Bend. Max padded silently at his side, every muscle tight with instinct. They had agreed there was no more hiding. The stolen lockbox had to be reclaimed, the truth laid bare. When they reached the clearing, the wagon stood waiting in its crooked posture, the mist wrapping it like a burial shroud. But they were not alone. 4 black trucks were parked nearby, engines still ticking, headlights casting beams across the trees. Men stood in the shadows, their outlines hard and deliberate. And at the center of it all stood Clayton Moorcock, patriarch of the family that had haunted Greywater for generations. Clayton was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with a barrel chest that spoke of a lifetime of physical work before wealth allowed him to pay others to labor. His face was square, weathered by sun and wind, a thick mane of silver hair combed back, and a trimmed gray beard that could almost pass for dignified, if not for the cold gleam in his dark eyes. He wore a heavy wool coat, black gloves, and the stance of a man used to being obeyed. His presence alone silenced the whispers of his henchmen. Beside him stood Victor Hale, the slick outsider with silver-shot hair and gray eyes that carried calculations rather than fear. Roy Jensen and Dale Crowder loitered near the trucks, rifles slung over their shoulders, their postures jittery but bolstered by the company they kept. And behind them all loomed Jonas Moorcock, Clayton's younger cousin. Jonas was a thick-set man in his 50s with a hawk nose, heavy jowls, and a cruel mouth. He wore a long leather coat and carried a shotgun with the casual arrogance of someone who had fired it before and would again without hesitation. Clayton's voice carried across the clearing, deep and steady. "You've stirred enough ghosts, Miller. That wagon doesn't belong to you. Neither does the box or the book. Hand them over, and maybe this ends quietly." John stepped forward, crowbar in hand, his breath steady despite the tension. "That wagon doesn't belong to you either. It belongs to the dead you buried with your lies." His tone was flat iron, honed by years of command in worse circumstances. Max growled low, amber eyes fixed on Jonas's shotgun. Sarah moved up beside John, her tall frame stiff, her gray eyes blazing. The Brennan family's journal names your ancestors. This isn't folklore, it's murder. You can't erase that. Clayton smirked, glancing at her with disdain. Little librarian thinks she's a crusader. Paper doesn't change power. We own this land and everything on it. Martha Henderson, her braid glistening in the lantern light, barked a laugh that cut the tension. You own fear, Clayton. That's all. And fear's about to lose its grip. She raised her old shotgun, hands steady. Clara, though trembling, stood behind them, flashlight clutched tight. She wasn't a fighter, but her hazel eyes shone with fierce defiance. Deputy Fletcher took a step forward, his uniform damp from the mist, his hand resting near his sidearm. Clayton Moorcock, I'm placing you and your men under suspicion of obstruction and theft. You return that lockbox now. His blue eyes hardened, every inch of his tall frame taut with conviction. Jonas barked a laugh. You think your little badge means anything? Donahue answers to us. You'll be gone by next week. He leveled his shotgun slightly, daring movement. The standoff snapped when Victor Hale stepped into the lantern light. His gray eyes glimmered with anticipation. We don't need talk. We need action. He gestured, and Roy and Dale raised their rifles. Max lunged first. With a bark that shattered the night, he charged toward Jonas as the man swung his shotgun. The blast cracked through the clearing, echoing across the ridge. Max collided with Jonas before the second shot could fire, teeth sinking into the man's arm. Jonas roared in pain, dropping the weapon. Chaos exploded. John surged forward, swinging his crowbar, striking Roy's rifle aside before it could aim. Fletcher drew his pistol, firing a warning shot into the dirt near Dale's boots, forcing him to stumble back. Sarah grabbed Clara, pulling her toward cover near the wagon. Martha held her shotgun level, shouting, "One more step and I put you down." Victor advanced on John, a knife glinting in his hand. He moved quick, too quick for a man his age, but John was ready. Combat instincts flared, and he blocked the thrust with the crowbar, sparks flying as metal scraped steel. The two men locked eyes, one fighting for greed, the other for justice. John shoved hard, forcing Victor back. Meanwhile, Clayton stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold, his dark eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to watch others do it for him. Jonas screamed as Max dragged him down, the German shepherd's powerful frame pressing him into the mud. John's heart hammered, fear for his companion mixing with pride. "Max, hold," he commanded, and the dog obeyed, teeth bared but not killing. Jonas gasped, clutching his bleeding arm. Finally, Fletcher stepped into the open, gun raised. His voice thundered. "Enough! This ends now!" The sharpness of his tone, combined with the chaos, froze the moment. Roy dropped his rifle, Dale followed, and Victor straightened, blade still in hand but eyes measuring. Clayton finally lifted a gloved hand, signaling, "Stand down." The clearing fell into ragged silence. John stood tall, Max pressed close to his leg, both ready. "This isn't about curses," he said, his voice steady. "It's about what your family did to the Brennans, and to others. We'll prove it, and the whole county will know." Clayton's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin, dangerous smile. "Truth doesn't matter, Miller. Control does. And you've just declared war." He turned, his men following, Jonas clutching his arm, Victor casting one last venomous look. The trucks roared to life and disappeared into the trees, leaving the clearing smelling of gasoline, blood, and rain. John exhaled slowly, his chest heavy. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her gray eyes fierce. "They won't stop." "No," John agreed, kneeling to rub Max's ears, his voice low but firm. "But neither will we." The night had revealed what the curse truly was, not phantoms or demons, but greed sharpened into violence. And it was far from over. The first light of morning spread across the Cascade Peaks, turning the mist into rivers of gold. For the first time in months, the valley felt less heavy, as though the mountains themselves had exhaled. John Miller stood at the steps of the Greywater Historical Society, with Max leaning against his leg, the dog's sable coat catching the dawn. Both carried the marks of the battles behind them. John's knuckles still bore faint bruises from Victor Hale's blade, and Max's left flank held a shallow scar from the scuffle with Jonas. Yet neither looked broken. They looked alive. Inside, the infamous wagon had been moved carefully, plank by plank, under the supervision of Sarah McKenna. She had spent nights cataloging each board, each marking until her thin frame nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Today, though, Sarah seemed taller. Her auburn hair fell loose across her shoulders instead of pinned back, her pale skin flushed with triumph. "It's done," she said softly, gray eyes shimmering. "The wagon is no longer a curse. It's evidence, and it's ours." The room had transformed into a living archive. The journal rested under protective glass, each brittle page preserved, its words projected on a screen for visitors. The lockbox, retrieved after Fletcher and state investigators pressured Roy and Dale into handing it over, sat unopened until federal archivists cracked it carefully. Inside were gold flakes, a folded claim deed stamped with dates, and a tintype photograph of the Brennan family, Thomas, Mary, and little Emma smiling shyly in her dress. That single photo silenced every doubt. They had been real, and they had been erased. Deputy Mark Fletcher stood watch near the door, his tall frame straighter than ever, in his crisp uniform. His blonde hair gleamed in the morning light, and his blue eyes carried a rare flicker of satisfaction. "The state's taken jurisdiction," he told them. "The Moorcocks won't bury this one. Agents are already freezing their assets." His tone hardened. "Clayton's influence ends here." Martha Henderson arrived carrying a basket of fresh bread, her silver braids swinging behind her. She set the food down on the table with the calm of a woman who had seen storms break before. "The town's buzzing," she said, her lined face softening. "For once, it's not out of fear. People are lining up to see the wagon. Parents are bringing their kids, telling them the truth instead of ghost stories. Maybe that's how healing starts." Clara Bennett stood near the glass case, staring at Emma Brennan's photograph. Her auburn hair was brushed neatly now, freckles bright against her pale skin. She whispered, "She looks like my brother when he was that age." Tears welled in her hazel eyes, but for the first time, they weren't only of grief, they were of release. If the Brennans get justice after a century, maybe Ben will too someday. John reached over, resting a scarred hand on her shoulder. "Justice takes time, Clara, but it comes." His voice, steady and low, carried the weight of belief rather than hope. Max pressed his head gently against Clara's hand, amber eyes soft, as though he too understood. Sarah straightened a stack of documents, her tall frame radiating resolve. "We'll keep digging. This isn't just about the Brennans. This is about every family that vanished while the Moorcocks grew rich. Their names deserve daylight." Her pale skin flushed with determination, her gray eyes flashing. "And daylight's finally here." For John, the end of the struggle meant the beginning of something else. A letter waited for him on Martha's counter, work at a nearby sawmill, steady pay, honest labor. He had agreed. After years of drifting, after months of fighting shadows, he finally felt ready to build again. That night, he and Max slept in a real cabin, its stove glowing, the smell of fresh-cut wood sharp in the air. Max stretched out by the fire, ears twitching in dreams, while John leaned back in a chair, letting the warmth ease scars that weren't all visible. At dawn, he walked outside, boots crunching frost, Max at his side. The valley stretched out before them, a world no longer haunted by whispers of wheels grinding in the dark. The wagon sat behind glass now, silent, no longer a prison of fear, but a teacher of truth. John looked to the horizon, the rising sun cutting through the last of the mist. "Sometimes," he said softly, rubbing Max's ear, "what we call haunted is just the past waiting for someone to face it." Max barked once, tail sweeping the ground. Together, man and dog stood in the new light, the curse broken, the truth alive, and the promise of tomorrow finally theirs. Sometimes light doesn't come as sudden fire from heaven, but in the steady strength of a man scarred by war and the loyal eyes of the dog who walked every mile beside him. John and Max proved that even shadows a century old can be broken, and that truth, once freed, shines brighter than fear. In your own life, remember this. What feels haunted may only be the past waiting for you to face it with courage and faith. May their story remind you to hold fast to kindness, to resilience, and to hope. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because more stories of redemption and light are on the way.